Hello debaters, the counterplan is a potent tool in the negative team's toolbox, but a good affirmative team knows how to effectively and strategically rebut the counterplan and render it useless. Today's video shows you how to answer counterplans with confidence and ease. To make things easier, I'll use an acronym that's been around for as long as counterplans themselves, and this acronym will help you remember all of your options when answering a counterplan. The acronym is POSTAL, P-O-S-T-A-L. Each letter represents one of the many strategies you'll want to consider when responding to counterplans, so let's get started. The first letter is P, and that stands for permutation, although most debaters refer to them simply as perms. A perm is designed to test the competitiveness of the counterplan. You'll recall from the counterplan video that a counterplan must be competitive, which means that a policymaker or a judge would not reasonably choose both the affirmative plan and the counterplan. To disprove the competitiveness of a counterplan, the affirmative team will offer one or more permutations or perms. You can think of a perm as a hypothetical test in which you, the affirmative team, propose a way in which the affirmative plan and the counterplan could coexist. This does not mean that you are changing the text of the affirmative plan, and it doesn't mean you're changing your advocacy. You still want the affirmative plan and only the affirmative plan to be the last plan standing at the end of the round. But in order to do that, you need to offer a perm. There are four types of perms that demonstrate how a counterplan is not competitive. The first type of perm is a normal perm, which means that both plans can be adopted at the same time without making changes to either plan. For example, the affirmative plan requires the federal government to make substantial investments in global renewable energy, and the counterplan requires China to make these investments instead. In this example, there is no reason why both countries could not invest in renewable energies at the same time, so the affirmative plan might simply perm the counterplan. It's important to remember that the affirmative team isn't suddenly changing their mind and deciding that we should do both plans. Instead, a perm is simply a way of saying that because you could do both plans, there is no reason to reject the affirmative plan. The second type of perm is a time frame perm. A time frame perm proposes to do the entire affirmative plan first and then all or some of the counterplan next, or vice versa. For example, if the affirmative plan is to end the use of domestic drones and the counterplan wants to increase the use of drones, the perm could be to end the use of drones until all the advantages of the affirmative plan are achieved, then increase the use of drones afterward. While the affirmative team would acknowledge that increasing drones isn't necessarily desirable, the perm itself demonstrates that the counterplan doesn't automatically kill off the affirmative plan's advantages. The third type of perm is an intrinsic perm. An intrinsic perm proposes to do the affirmative plan and the counterplan, but adds some component that wasn't part of either plan. This added component functions like a bridge to connect the two plans, even though the bridge was not originally part of either plan. For example, the affirmative plan wants to use the federal government to tackle homelessness, and the counterplan wants the states to deal with homelessness. The intrinsic perm could be to have the federal government give grants to the states to deal with homelessness in each state. Now notice that these grants were not part of either plan originally, but they're added by the affirmative team as part of the perm to demonstrate how the federal government can and should be the primary agent of action to pass the plan. Be aware that the intrinsic perms can sometimes represent a shift in advocacy for the affirmative, which means that the affirmative team is no longer advocating their exact original plan. In our example, the affirmative plan text said nothing of grants, but the perm now includes these grants. So the affirmative team will need to be careful to explain that the shift in advocacy is simply a hypothetical test and not necessarily a proposed change for the affirmative. The fourth type of perm is a severance perm. A severance perm is the opposite of an intrinsic perm. Instead of adding something to make the plan and the counterplan work, a severance perm removes something to make the plan and the counterplan work together. For example, the affirmative plan might be to invest federal money in solar energy, and the counterplan might be to invest private money in solar energy. The severance perm might be to have the federal government and all U.S.-based companies invest money in solar energy. By excluding companies based overseas, the severance perm includes all of the affirmative plan and most of the counterplan. Again, the affirmative team is dangerously close to shifting advocacy when running intrinsic and severance perms, so it's important that the affirmative team understands the theory supporting their perm. In summary, a permutation is a hypothetical test of the competitiveness of the counterplan. And there are a variety of perms that you can use to demonstrate that the counterplan itself does not require the abandonment of the affirmative plan. Affirmative teams should always be prepared to offer one or more permutations as their first response to a counterplan. The second letter in our acronym is O, and that stands for offense. By offense, I mean that you should provide several arguments that show how the counterplan is a bad idea. You can think of offense in the same way you do when you are negative. The affirmative proposes a plan, and as the negative team, you attack that plan and show why it's a bad idea. Okay, so those same strategies apply when you're the affirmative team trying to attack a counterplan. You can even run a disadvantage against the counterplan. For example, if the negative team proposes a state's counterplan, you can run a spending disadvantage that shows how states cannot run into deficit spending, and therefore the economic disadvantages to the states having to do this plan are far worse than the federal government doing this plan. The third letter in our acronym is S, and it stands for solvency. As the affirmative team, you should always take time to look for solvency deficits. The solvency deficit is the gap between what the affirmative plan solves for and what the negative counterplan solves for. Now, oftentimes there's a gap or deficit in the counterplan solvency, or more simply, the affirmative plan solves for 100% of the problem, while the counterplan only solves for 80% of the problem. Now, it's up to you as the affirmative team to study the solvency evidence presented as part of the counterplan, and it's up to you to find and explain the solvency deficit. But affirmative teams that can effectively illustrate a solvency deficit are much more likely to win. The next letter in our acronym is T, which stands for theory. You'll recall from the counterplan video that there are three statuses for a counterplan. Unconditional, which means that the negative will not kick the counterplan under any condition. Conditional, which means the negative may kick the counterplan, and dispositional, which means the negative will only kick the counterplan if a specific set of conditions applies. Nearly all counterplans are conditional, so good affirmative teams should be prepared to read some theory arguments to demonstrate why conditionality, or condo, is bad. These theory arguments are often found in handbooks and online debate evidence websites, and they essentially help the affirmative team argue that since the affirmative team is required to defend their affirmative plan text throughout the entire round, then the negative team should be held to the same standard. There may be other theory arguments to run as part of your defense against the counterplan, and they are often uniquely determined by the counterplans themselves. Next, we have the letter A, which stands for add-on advantage. An add-on advantage is an advantage offered by the affirmative team in the 2AC that wasn't introduced in the 1AC. You don't need a counterplan in the 1AC to justify reading on an add-on advantage. In fact, if you ever find yourself with extra time in the 2AC, you can introduce another advantage. Since this is still a constructive speech, and since you answered all of the negative team's arguments presented in the 1NC, an add-on advantage can provide even more reasons for the judge to vote affirmative. In the presence of a counterplan, an add-on advantage also helps the affirmative team demonstrate the superiority of the affirmative plan, because the add-on advantage should only stem from adopting the affirmative plan. The add-on advantage should never link to both the affirmative plan and the counterplan, otherwise you're doing more harm than good by reading it. The final letter is L, which stands for the link to the net benefit, or the disadvantage. If you can successfully disprove the link between the affirmative plan and the disadvantage, you can also disprove the need for a counterplan. Similarly, if you can link the disadvantage to the counterplan, you can disprove the net benefit. So if the negative team runs a state's counterplan and a federalism disadvantage that claims federal plans lead to civil war, then disproving the link between your plan and civil war also disproves the need to enact a plan through the states. The postal acronym is a great way to remember all the strategies available to you as the affirmative team when defending your plan against a counterplan. But the most effective strategy is to be ready for the counterplan before you even walk into the tournament. Most of the strategies I've laid out for you in this video require lots of advanced preparation. You can't debate theory until you've downloaded and studied the theory files. You can't run add-on advantages that only link to the affirmative plan if you haven't taken time during the week to develop those specific advantages that are specific to that counterplan. And you really can't demonstrate a solvency deficit without evidence to prove that the counterplan doesn't solve nearly as well as the negative team claims. The best strategy for success is to be very aware of all the counterplans that could potentially threaten your affirmative plan. If you take the time on Monday through Friday to develop a list of effective counterplans, you can spend your week developing the files necessary to defend against it. That's it for counterplans. Let's take a moment to review each of the steps and the concepts we've learned in today's video. Permutations, time frame perm, intrinsic perm, severance perm, offense, solvency deficit, theory, add-on advantage, link to the net benefit. That's all for now. Good luck, debaters.